Pursuant to Section 2A of House Resolution 996, House Resolution 995 is hereby adopted.
So, Christina, your reaction now that we have watched this vote actually take place, is this a win for Republicans? How do they spin this? What's the headline if you're sort of trying to lead the messaging for them?
Well, for the Republicans right now, I mean, they're obstructionists, and that is their only goal, to make sure that Joe Biden can just not really move forward with any particular agenda. They want to control the agenda to essentially tell their primary voters, especially, whatever Democrats want, we've just said no, even if it's something that they've previously agreed on. So since the speaker has, had some colossal failures in his very short tenure, he's going to market this as any minor win is just, I've got my caucus under control. We are a unified group. We know that there are several factions within the Republican Party, but the Republican Party thus far has not put forward any new ideas in the legislative branch. Their only goal, as Curtis mentioned before, is to try and impeach folks. We've asked them several times, well, you want to impeach all these individuals in the Democratic Party for what? What crimes? What misdemeanors? And it doesn't matter. They just know that our voters want blood. They want red meat, and we're going to give it to them. And so even if it does end up with a little egg on their faces, they'll still keep trying because they want to make sure that Joe Biden is seen as ineffective when they go to their voters in November.
We're now going to bring back NBC News congressional correspondent Julie Surkin, who's in Washington with more. Julie, talk to me. What can you tell me?
Well, this vote just closed, as you see on your screen. The House voted 214 to 213 along party lines to impeach the Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas. 3 Republicans voted against doing so, the same that we saw in that initial failed vote last week. That includes Tom McClintock of California, Mike Gallagher of Wisconsin, who has since announced that he will be resigning, not seeking another term in Congress, and also Ken Buck of Colorado, who is also retiring at the end of his term. Nonetheless, this now seals the deal. The first time in 150 years that a cabinet secretary has been impeached by the House. This will now go over to the Senate, whereas we were just talking about, Charles, that is very unlikely that Senate Democrats, of course, who control that Senate, act on this, that they hold Mayorkas accountable for what they say is a political exercise. Nonetheless, they are required to take this up, hold some sort of trial, certainly with cabinet secretaries as opposed to presidents, for example, as we've seen with former President Trump. The process is a little bit different. Majority Leader Schumer gets to dictate that somewhat, but certainly this is seen as a partisan and political process by Democrats, by the Homeland Security Department itself, which just released a statement to that effect. And certainly the Senate will have to take this up once they're back from recess, which is not going to be this week. It's not going to be next week. It's not going to be dealt with likely until the end of February, if not March.
Julie, have you heard throughout today, as you know, there is a special election going on in New York. It's for the replacement of George Santos' seat, which only brings to bear how important these thin margins in the House of Representatives are. Has that at all been a conversation among any of the members you've talked to about what that would do to even the scales in a situation like this?
Certainly, it's not happening in a vacuum. The reason you're seeing this vote take place tonight of all nights is because you also have that special election happening on Long Island in New York 3 to replace George Santos, who, of course, was kicked out of Congress at the end of last year. And certainly Republicans saw tonight as maybe their final shot to impeach Alejandro Mayorkas, somebody who they've said has mishandled the crisis at the border, who has misrepresented the facts at the border to the American people. And so certainly tonight was their last chance to do it, because they could very well see a Democrat flip that seat. Certainly that election has not been decided yet, but that was definitely a political calculation they had. And they, of course, needed Steve Scalise, who is standing a few feet away from me here to my right, to come back from his cancer treatment to cast that vote, because we saw what happened last week when they didn't have enough votes to proceed.
Secretary Mayorkas has just released the following statement, quote, House Republicans will be remembered by history for trampling on the Constitution for political gain rather than working to solve the serious challenges at our border. While Secretary Mayorkas was helping a group of Republican and Democratic senators develop bipartisan solutions to strengthen border security and get needed resources for reinforcement, House Republicans have wasted months with this baseless, unconstitutional impeachment. Christina, your reaction to what we've just seen on the House floor and, of course, Homeland Security Secretary Mayorkas' statement?
I mean, Charles, you just said it. Every moment we spend on useless impeachment shenanigans and political theater is time spent away from actually providing goods and services for American people. I mean, this is the whole Republican agenda. They refuse to work on legislation, policy, and moving this country forward. They are really obsessed with the theatrics of it all. But even when it goes to the Senate, and we know Chuck Schumer runs a tight ship, and we know that the vast majority of Democrats will, do their due diligence as, they are sworn to do, but it's still a waste of time. And so any time that they're spending going through and making sure that, they dot their I's and cross their T's the way they should, it's time that they're not making legislation. It's time that they're not researching. It's time that they're not moving this country forward for the myriad of issues that are in front of us, domestic and international. And so, I think Toni Morrison said, racism is, I'm paraphrasing, essentially a time suck, right? It's meant to sort of waste our time and take time away from us. The same way Republicans, they want to take time away from effectiveness of Democrats. And they've been relatively successful ever since Donald Trump got his hands on the reins of the presidency.
Welcome back to The ReidOut. The game is on, and the ball is in special counsel Jack Smith's court in terms of Trump's ongoing effort to delay his federal election interference case over a bogus claim of presidential immunity. This morning, the Supreme Court responded to Trump's request to put on hold the last week. The D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, their ruling that rejected that immunity claim. He wants to stop it. He wants to stop everything in order to hear more about why his claim was rejected. Chief Justice John Roberts is giving the special counsel 1 week to respond to Trump's request, even though it's unlikely that Smith's team is actually going to take that long. But the bigger question here, the one that everybody's wondering, is what exactly is the Supreme Court going to do next? Joining me now to discuss all of this is former federal prosecutor, my friend, and super lawyer, Glenn Kirshner, MSNBC legal analyst and host of the Justice Matters podcast. Sir, I have not been able to take off my glasses the entire night. We've had a big one in terms of news, but now I get to talk to a lawyer and finally do that. First and foremost, what are the chances that Jack Smith responds and the Supreme Court says, we're not going to deal with this? Because I'm not convinced that they're actually going to take the case and review it at all, but you may think different.
I agree with you, Charles. I think there's going to be some really powerful foreshadowing by what the Supreme Court does on the stay issue. Think about it. I agree with you. Jack Smith may not take the full 7 days, even though 7 days is a pretty short fuse deadline. We may see something in 2 or 3 days because Jack Smith understands, as do we all, that we're burning democracy daylight. There's a real urgency to get this case to trial. So if the Supreme Court refuses to stay the case, they return it to Judge Chutkan, telling her, put it back on the trial track. I think that will be powerful foreshadowing that they will either not take it up at all and just let the trial proceed, or if they do take it up, maybe it's because they want to be the big dogs on the block. And even though they agree with the resolution by the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, they want to write the words for posterity and put their own spin on why a president should not be permitted to commit crimes against the American people while in office and, remain completely unaccountable for those crimes. So I think it's not the whole ball game, Charles, to stay, but boy, it's a good 7 or 8 innings of the ball game.
I hadn't considered the idea that they might take it just to put the nail in the coffin and definitively, like you said, for posterity, make it absolutely and abundantly clear that this absolute immunity thing that he's argued it's not a thing. And that's an interesting point. My money is on the fact that they're not going to take the case at all. But let's shift gears. We're going to go down to Fulton County in Georgia. There's been a lot of conversation as we have watched this controversy develop about the Fulton County DA's office, particularly Fulton County DA Fani Willis, and an alleged inappropriate relationship that she had with one of her special assistants. We are looking at a hearing on Thursday where the judge has already stated that, or leaned or suggested that there may be sufficient evidence to support a disqualification of the DA here. If you are, who has more cause to be concerned? Is it Trump's team as they may smell an out, or Fani Willis's team as they may smell trouble?
Yeah, there's a little bit for everybody to dislike about the way this is playing out. But here's the thing, Charles. Let's get an evidentiary hearing rather than having this issue bouncing around in the court of public opinion where there are no rules of procedure, there are no rules of evidence. And what Judge McAfee said is, listen, there's a possibility that this relationship and any financial entanglements, might result in a disqualification, but we won't know anything until we have an evidentiary hearing. What I've seen on the papers that have been filed thus far, it's hard to see how any of this inures to the detriment of any of the defendants. If anything, it looks like it might be a matter for bar counsel to take up if there was some ethical misstep. But listen, the best way to resolve this is by, putting it in the full light of day in an evidentiary hearing controlled by Judge McAfee, who seems to be up to the task. He's been doing a pretty good job presiding over these cases, and then we're going to have to let the chips fall.
Glenn, last question. Donald Trump, between now and February 24th, which is the Republican primary in South Carolina, is going to be all over the map with court appearances and everything else. What's the one date that you're watching for? He's got appearances in New York. There's the Section 4 stuff that's going on in Florida, and then obviously the other things that are going across the map. What are you watching for in particular?
Charles, I'm looking for 2 days from right now, Thursday, because that's when he's going to be back in court in New York in his falsifying business records case, which is really an election interference case, interfering with the 2016 election. And I think his attorneys are going to push hard to have Judge Merchan vacate or postpone his March 25th trial, because if the judge holds that trial date, he's going to be in trial starting March 25th, and he's going to be in trial every day for weeks and weeks and weeks. That's going to really cramp his campaigning style.
Grand and glorious as always. Glenn Kirshner hits it right on the money. Thank you so much for being with us. And that's going to do it for tonight's ReidOut. I'm Charles Coleman Jr. Joy will be back here tomorrow night.